Thank you. So I'm generally talking about results that we have for the SMAP VAX experiment that ran from 2019 through 2022, with 2022 having some radar flight data from USDA. And so I'll be looking into how soil moisture trends related to that radar data. And I want to acknowledge, of course, many collaborators on the experiment, including Mike Kosh and Andreas, who ran a lot of the data collections. Also, Brian Lamb from USGS helped out with some comments on this presentation. So here I have a picture from SMAP, although I will not be talking about any SMAP results. That is because to explain the name of the experiment, so that we need the soil moisture active passive to acknowledge that. And mainly the purpose was to improve soil moisture retrievals over forests. So NASA arranged some flights for USDA during 2019, and it was end of April and a little bit early May. And then we had a lot of July flights, maybe 5 more in July. And I'm also going to be looking at the, we installed a lot of the soil moisture setups from USDA, and we have a vertical probe that goes from 0 to 5 centimeter, and we have a 5 centimeter probe and a 10 centimeter probe. I'll be mainly looking at the 5 centimeter results. And we also measure temperature data and Findo camera. That's also included in this presentation. So basically, I'm wondering, how do soil, plant, and surface water dynamics impact the UVSAR radar data at the forested sites? And this is special because it's there's not a lot of frequent dense radar time series, other than you might schedule with ALOS, for example. That's a popular one. But the upcoming NISA mission will have this also routinely globally. And yeah, it might launch as early as January 2024. So here's a map of the study site. So we had over 20 stations set up, and they're all the white circles. A couple of them had a little bit more instrumentation, such as sap flow and 3 dielectric probes. And those are highlighted in the squares and the diamonds. And we have the SMAP grid cell is basically the boundary of all the 9-kilometer east grids I'm showing here. So this is a pretty large scale experiment, and there's this large Quabbin reservoir in the southeast. And Amherst, University of Massachusetts Amherst, I was working out of that place during the course of the experiment. So for the materials, we're using UVSAR data, and the flights were mainly morning. So I'm taking data from around 8 to 10 a.m., that average for comparison. And we have multiple flight lines. So the UVSAR swath is too small to cover that whole 33-kilometer pixel. So we have to do about 4 to get that in there. So have composite the data to make a nice map out of it. Then we have the soil moisture from the setups I showed, and we have some tree data. There's a lot more data for the experiments, but what I'm using here is the relative permittivity time series and the tree temperature, showing that as well, and some phenocam data. It's basically just the upward-looking wildlife camera, so it's not a classical type of phenocamera. And then for water layer, I use a National Wetland Inventory map. So the method is very simple. It's just kind of like a climatology, just looking at the radar cross-section, how it changed compared to the mean at each state over time. That's the main analysis step here. So I want to go into the in situ data. So we have the soil moisture data, and these are just the uncalibrated raw data from the loggers for the 24 stations. And there's some variability, but a lot of them agree. All of them agree that summer generally had a lower soil moisture than spring, and then picked up again starting September. So there's agreement there. And although the stations were distributed quite differently throughout the SMAP pixel, the numbers are not that different from, let's say, 0.25 in spring and maybe 0.2 in the fall, and then maybe 0.1 in the summer. So generally, I would say they're relatively consistent with each other. And this is typical for forests, I suppose, when you have the spring melt coming in and the thawing of the ground, and then you have a higher soil moisture, and then in fall you have more rainfall again, recharging the soil moisture levels. And meanwhile, it's just drying out, but not all the years. So I would say, so then from this perspective, right, we would expect that the radar result, if it can detect soil moisture, that would decrease from spring to summer. So basically we had these flights, one some in spring in April, the others in July. So we should hopefully see a nice gradient if that comes out to bear, if we can say that there's some relationship between soil moisture and the radar signal. Then I also put some pictures from the streamflow gauges, USGS streamflow gauges in the area. And the main point of this picture is just to show, okay, there was a lot of streamflow from the snow melt, etc. In the spring. And then the other date, a summer date, the last date of UV observations was very low. And these are all on different scales, but they're just relative to each individual gauge. So then what's happening with the vegetation, right? So for the spring data, all of the data takes were taken, completed by May 6th was the last data flight from UVSAR, and there weren't really any leaves on the trees just yet. They started coming out shortly after, around May 10 in that year. So that's just to make clear that the leaf wasn't there, but of course they are fully there in the middle of summer. And so probably we don't have a lot of leaf impact in spring. And if there's leaf impact by the leaves in the summer, we might still not be able to see it. It's then a competition between the soil signal and the leaves. And we'll get into that when I look at the radar data. So then we have also the tree dialectic and temperature data. So temperature data, I'm showing the different years just to show the time series for each year, 2019, and can step forward. But what you will see is that the temperature data is pretty much on point for all of the trees in different parts of the pixel, whereas the dielectric is fairly constant for most of them, except that birch tree in the purple. That's kind of the odd one out, as you see, for example, in 2020. So it's pretty high in spring and then drops down and by June quite a bit in the dielectric relative permittivity. So the idea is that the permittivity should show up in the SMAP radar signal, because if you have a high moisture in the trees, high water content in the trees, then you would expect more backscatter, generally speaking. So, but because the signal is fairly constant over the years, so I'm stepping through here, the upper chart, then probably any large variation in the radar signal cannot just be explained by what's going on in the tree stem, except for maybe the birch. Maybe there are a lot of birch trees there. So what I'm showing here is there's some old statistics for the different types of forests that they have at Harvard Forest. And let's say the northern hardwood forests, and birch is one of those, and one of the components. So I don't know exactly the prevalence of birch trees, but it could have some impact on the scale of the whole study area if there's a large proportion of the northern hardwoods, if that's birch. And then the other forests, we have oak pine and the oak hickory. So those were all the constant ones. The only one that showed some variation in the relative permittivity was really the birch. And we don't have enough data really to extrapolate to a general rule of thumb, and that might be useful to do in following experiments in the forest, to maybe take more tree dielectric measurements to see if it's really that constant, or maybe it was just a poorly installed probe or such. Thank you. So looking at the UVSAR data, I don't want to talk about this too much, but this is just a flow chart for how you would prepare the UVSAR data to flatten the terrain, to account for the terrain and the view geometry. And this is just a tool based on a NASA tool. It's a very powerful tool. You can build your own workflows within it, sort of. That's what I did. And I did that to process all the radar data. And what's the effect is shown here in the upper image. So this is kind of like the sigma 0 radio cross section that you get when you're downloading the radar data from the repository. But then after you're correcting it, flattens out. So you can see before you get in the far range. So the look range is kind of like starts up on the right, then looking towards the left. So you get lower values with the looking angle. So when you're kind of closer to looking straight down, you get a higher return values. But we want to correct for that because we just want to figure out what's in the landscape. Like if there's so much on an inclined plane, you want it to be comparable to so much on a flat plane, for example. So how do I build these mosaics, right? I crop them down a little bit. This is the green and the blue, except for the light blue one on the leftmost image, light blue outline. That's a full UV data take. But the other ones, I crop them down to get rid of some of those extreme near and far range angles. But there's still some impacts. And then you make a composite. So I have here a time series a composite. So this is kind of like a typical composite you might see with ALOS data, where we have the copol and the red channel. We have the crosspole and the green channel, and then we have the ratio of the copol over the crosspole and the blue channel, and they're all stretched to the same proportion, 2 to 98%. And this is to tease out the relative how they vary relative to each other over time. And the scale, I kept them constant for each IOP, but the scale, as I note at the bottom right, is a little bit different. The HH is a little bit smaller, and crosspole is also a little bit smaller. So they did decrease during the IOPs. So as I'm stepping forward, you see there's some subtle shades here, but I zoomed in on some area called Tom Swamp, right? So I'm going to April 30. There's some more violet showing up that's indicative of the wetland double bounce effect. There's being more water underneath, and I think we might have gotten actually flooded out from that site on our field trip on April 30th. And also I have on vertical bar here, I have the soil moisture time series right on the right hand side, showing the dates. And basically the soil moisture levels were kind of similar, stepping backwards, we're kind of similar during these spring data takes. And then we have May 6th data take. So there's a little bit less again, a little bit less double bounce, indicating water underneath the canopy, right? So moving forward to summer, there's not very much of that blue component in there throughout. So there's a little variations, and they happen to occur usually about, it looks like 2 days or so, 2 to 3 days after the precipitation event. So it seems like there's a little bit of a lag time. Whereas when I showed the stream flow before, they're pretty much on target with the rainfall. And maybe the night after, or like the following day, it's already all peaked and dropping down. Whereas these darker areas fill up in the map here a couple days later. So there's some lag. So this is basically the main analysis I'm doing here. So this is a relative measure. So that means that on that date, on April 25th, it was relatively moist all across the board. I shouldn't say moist. The radial cross section was higher all across the board than the long-term average, right? Than the climatology. And it's pretty uniform. There's not a lot of spatial variability. It's pretty strong. Then as you step forward, it decreases closer towards the normal, which is the white color. And then stepping forward to April 30, right? We're getting some interesting patterns here, right? We get some areas that have relatively smaller radial cross sections, and others that have relatively larger ones than the normal. And then going further again into May, this is May 6th, so everything is a little bit drying down according to that. And it doesn't quite match the soil moisture data, because again, the soil moisture itself is kind of on the same on these dates. And going forwards, even further, jumping over to summer, yes, it's the radial cross sections are much smaller, but between those dates, although there's also rainfall, they're kind of similar to one another. So sure, it gets a little bit darker on July 22nd on the southern half, even lower values for that. And so there's some spatial differences. But what that shows is basically in accordance with the soil moisture in general, radial cross section decreased from spring to summer. So in the big scheme of things, right? But maybe the small pulses might not show up at the stations, might be a little bit difficult to use that radar data directly to be able to retrieve those small changes. And then going forward, I'm zooming in at the April 31. The very interesting thing is when you compare this to the wetland inventory, which is here, these red areas, they really line up very well with the wetland inventory data. Plus, you see some connectivity. So if you just use the wetland map, you would see some of the connectivity would be implied, but here you can actually see it via the red areas, as what I'm suggesting here. And it's also in line with some of the field work that we had. We know, for example, 4.8 was down in a swamp area, and this is Tom Swamp area right here at 4.4.4.5. So those all show up as reddish. And so in conclusion, what we got out of this is your visa can't really tell something about soil moisture, but can it really tell within season? That's not clear. And it was really great at teasing out something about the surface hydrology as well. So it's all impacting it. Now about the leaves, we cannot really say, but if the leaves were really that important, it didn't obviously show. It was still mainly the soil moisture that led to the decreases. So the low soil moisture, low radar cross sections. That is still very much the trend here. And I just want to acknowledge the computing resources from USDA to do some of these calculations. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I think we've got time for one question. No? All right. Oh, it looks like.
Good afternoon. You'd shown your time series on a slide, and one of them seemed to be abnormally high. Would you happen to know why that is? Is it because of something like landscape position or high clay content?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't quite catch that.
There was a slide in which you'd shown your soil moisture time series.
Yes.
And one of the sensors seemed to be reading abnormally high compared to the rest of them.
Yeah, right. One of them was high, and there was also one that was potentially bad and should be kicked out of this time series, but it was just a kind of qualitative look. But that's a good point. So yeah, there was also one sensor we installed kind of in a wetland, so that could be very well the reason. That's kind of like one of the careful considerations one should have when installing these sensors. But sometimes you might not know it's an ephemeral wetland until after, and until you look at the data where it shows you can see things are flooded. So this pink color, maybe this 4.8. No, that's maybe I'm 4.8. It's probably the 4.8 sensor. That was definitely was wet for much of the year. It was a very long vernal pool period there. It was next to like a road to cross this kind of swamp water body that got washed out. So there's a lot of hydrologic activity in that area, surface water activity. So that explains that one. Yeah. Any other questions?